"Don't move, follow me." I said it low and steady, just 3 words, but something in the way I said them made the woman in the back seat go still and listen to a man she'd barely spoken 10 words to in the month I'd been driving her. We were stopped on a quiet street, and I had just understood with the cold certainty of a part of my life I thought I'd left behind forever, that the 2 vehicles boxing us in were not an accident, that the men getting out of them were not lost, and that the woman I'd been hired to drive was about 10 seconds away from being taken or killed. And the thing that turned my blood to ice, the thing I didn't tell her yet, was that I already had a terrible suspicion about who had sent them. Because professionals like that don't come for an ordinary heiress on a random Tuesday. Somebody who knew her schedule had sent them. Somebody close. I'm going to tell you the whole story, who I really was under the plain black suit of a hired driver, what happened on that street, and the gut-wrenching truth about who was behind it, which is the part I still can't think about without my chest going tight. But first, I want to tell you the thing this whole nightmare taught me, because it's the heart of it. Sometimes the people who share your blood will betray you for money, and sometimes a stranger you've barely noticed will lay everything on the line to save your life. We don't get to choose which is which. We only get to choose which one will be. Quick word before I dive in, and then I'll let the story carry us. I'm not a man who's comfortable talking about myself. You'll understand exactly why by the end, so I'll keep this short. If you've ever been underestimated or ever been let down by the very people who were supposed to protect you, then this one's going to hit close to home, and I'd be honored if you stayed with me to the end. The subscribe button's down there if you want to ride along. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, before the men on that street, to a quiet man who just wanted to drive a car and go home to his daughter. My name is Reuben Cross. I'm 39 years old, and at the time of this story I was working as a personal driver. A plain, quiet, low-level job, driving a wealthy woman to her meetings and back. And I was a single father. My daughter's name is Nell. She's 6 years old, and she is the whole reason for everything I do and everything I am. Nell's mother left when Nell was just a baby, decided this life wasn't what she wanted and walked out. And it had been the 2 of us ever since, Nell and her dad against the world. I built my whole life around that little girl, and the quiet driving job, with its steady hours, was a big part of how I did it. It got me home to her every night, dependable, ordinary, safe. But here's the thing you need to understand about me, the thing that nobody I worked for knew, because I had very deliberately kept it that way. I had not always been a quiet driver. In another life, before Nell, I had been a soldier, and then something more specialized than a soldier. I'd spent years in a world of protective operations, the kind of work where keeping a person alive in a dangerous place was the entire job, where reading a street for threats was as automatic as breathing. I was very good at it. I'd been trained, over many hard years, to see the things ordinary people never see, to feel an ambush before it happened, to stay calm in the exact moment when everyone else falls apart. That was who I used to be, and I walked away from all of it. For now, because you cannot raise a baby while you're flying off to dangerous places, and because I did not want my daughter growing up around the man that work had made me, around the things I'd seen and done. I wanted her to have an ordinary, safe, gentle childhood with an ordinary dad. So I put that whole life down on purpose, buried it deep, and became Reuben, the quiet driver. A man with a clean, simple job and a little girl and no past worth mentioning. As far as anyone knew, I was nobody. A guy in a black suit who held the door and kept his mouth shut. That's exactly what I wanted to be. I won't dramatize the old life, because the people who really did that work don't, and a lot of it isn't the kind of thing you tell at dinner. I'll just say that for a long stretch of years I lived in a version of the world most people are lucky enough never to see, where danger wasn't an event. It happened to you once, but a condition you lived inside, every hour of every day, until reading a room for threats was as automatic as breathing. It does something to a man, that life. It sharpens you and it costs you, both at once. And the day I held my newborn daughter for the first time, something in me simply decided, all at once and completely, that she was never going to know that version of her father. that she would have an ordinary dad with ordinary hours and no shadows in him. A man who fixed her cereal and read her stories and was home, every single night, the same. So I walked away from all of it. I traded the whole hard, dangerous life for a black suit and a steering wheel, and a 6-year-old's bedtime, and I never once regretted the trade. The quiet was the point. The quiet was the prize. I had buried the dangerous man so deep that some days I almost believed he was gone for good. He wasn't gone. He was just sleeping. And a quiet street and 2 coordinated vehicles were about to wake him all the way up. The woman I drove was named Sabrina Holt. And Sabrina Holt was, in the simplest terms, an heiress, the only child of a very wealthy man who had built a large and successful company over a lifetime. And here's the part that matters. Her father had died only a few months before I came to work for her. Recently, suddenly. She was newly grieving, newly alone, and newly, overwhelmingly, the sole heir to her father's entire fortune and his company. She'd inherited all of it, and with it, though neither of us understood this yet, she'd inherited a target on her back. She was, when I knew her, a sad and guarded woman. She'd just lost her father, who by all accounts she'd adored, and she carried that grief like a stone. She was polite to me, but distant, the way wealthy people often are with staff. I was the driver, a function, not a person. She didn't know my name was Reuben for the first 2 weeks. That was fine. I wasn't there to be her friend. I was there to drive and to go home to Nell. I noticed things about her the way I notice everything. That she was lonelier than a woman with all that money should be, that she flinched at the size of the empty house, that grief had hollowed her out. But I kept my observations to myself and I drove the car. That was the job. But I'll tell you what I saw because it matters to what came later. I saw a woman rattling around inside a grief so large it had swallowed her whole. Her father had been her entire world, by every sign I could read, and his sudden death had left her unmoored in a way all the money on earth couldn't touch. The big house was silent. The phone that should have been full of people checking on a grieving daughter mostly wasn't. She had wealth and position, and almost no one who actually loved her, which is its own particular kind of poverty, and a worse one than mine. And into that loneliness, in those weeks, came the one family member who did show up, her Uncle Gerald, full of warmth and concern, the grieving brother, the doting uncle. And I watched her cling to him because he was all she had left, because a person drowning in grief will reach for any hand that's offered. I watched her trust him completely, and some cold, quiet instinct in me didn't like it, didn't like him, couldn't have told you why. I had no proof of anything. So I said nothing, and I drove the car, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I have thought a great deal since about whether I should have said something sooner. But what would I have said? That I had a bad feeling about the one person comforting her? You can't protect someone from a feeling. What I did not know in those first weeks was that a storm was already gathering around Sabrina Holt, and that it was coming from the one direction she would never have thought to watch, her own family. Because there was an uncle, Gerald Holt, her late father's younger brother. And from the little I saw of him in the few times he came around, something about the man set off a quiet alarm in the back of my trained mind, the way certain people just do. He was all warmth on the surface, the grieving brother, the doting uncle, very solicitous of poor Sabrina in her time of loss. But there was a coldness underneath it, a calculation in his eyes when he looked at her, that I clocked and filed away and said nothing about, because it wasn't my place and I had no proof of anything but a feeling. I just knew, the way you know these things after enough years reading people, that Gerald Holt's grief didn't reach his eyes. What I'd later learn, what the whole world would later learn, was this. Gerald Holt had spent his entire life in his successful brother's shadow, resentful, entitled, certain that the company and the fortune should have been at least half his. And when his brother died and left everything to Sabrina, a daughter Gerald considered soft and undeserving, something in him curdled all the way through. He wanted it, all of it. And there was exactly one thing standing between Gerald Holt and the inheritance he'd convinced himself he was owed. His niece, Sabrina, his own brother's child. And so, Gerald Holt made a decision so monstrous that even now, knowing all of it, I have trouble believing a human being could make it. He decided to have Sabrina killed, to make it look like an accident or a random crime, so that her death would pass to him the control he craved. He quietly hired men, professionals, dangerous men, the kind you hire when you want a person to disappear and don't want it traced back to you, and he set them on his own niece, the man who'd held her as a baby, the man who sat at her father's funeral with a sorrowful face. He sent killers after his own blood for money. I've turned that over in my mind more times than I can count, trying to understand how a man gets there, and I think the terrible answer is that he didn't get there all at once. Nobody decides to murder their niece over breakfast one morning. It happens in inches. First, the resentment, the lifelong grievance of the brother who felt overlooked. Then the entitlement, the story he told himself for decades about what he was really owed. Then the rationalization, the quiet, ugly voice that whispers she doesn't even deserve it. She'll just waste it. It should have been mine. And then, finally, when his brother died and left it all to a daughter Gerald had decided was unworthy, the last wall came down, and a man who'd probably once been ordinary stepped across a line most of us can't imagine approaching. That's the thing about that kind of evil. It rarely looks like a monster. It looks like a tired, resentful, ordinary man who let greed eat him hollow over a lifetime until there was nothing left inside but the wanting. Gerald Holt didn't think of himself as a villain. I'm certain of it. He thought of himself as a man correcting an injustice, taking back what was rightfully his. That's how these things always work. The worst things people do, they usually do while feeling sorry for themselves. And the cost of his self-pity was going to be a young woman's life, his own brother's daughter, the little girl he'd once bounced on his knee. And Sabrina had no idea. She trusted him. He was her uncle, her last close family, the one person she thought she had left in the world after her father died. She leaned on him in her grief. And the whole time, he was planning her murder. The only thing Gerald Holt hadn't accounted for, the one variable he couldn't have known about, was that the quiet, forgettable driver his niece had recently hired was not a quiet, forgettable driver at all. He'd looked at me, the few times he saw me, the same way Sabrina did, as furniture, as nobody. He had no way of knowing that the nobody in the black suit had spent years doing exactly the kind of work designed to stop exactly the kind of thing he was planning. He'd accidentally put the one man who could ruin his plan right in the driver's seat of his niece's car. I want to tell you about the day it happened, and I want to be careful how I tell it because I'm not going to turn this into some action movie, and there are details I won't dwell on for reasons you'll understand. But here's what happened. I was driving Sabrina back from somewhere, an ordinary afternoon, a route I'd driven before. And the part of me I thought I'd retired, the part that never really sleeps, that's always reading the road whether I want it to or not, started picking things up. A vehicle that had been with us too long, matching our turns. Then a second one, working with the first, the way they do. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold, familiar certainty settled over me. The certainty I'd hoped I'd never feel again. We were being followed, this was coordinated, and it was about to happen. I need to describe that feeling because it's the hinge of the whole thing. For years I had worked to switch that part of myself off, to stop reading every car in the mirror, to let a drive just be a drive, to trust the ordinary, safe world I'd chosen for Nell, and stop scanning it for dangers that, in my new life, simply weren't there. And I'd mostly succeeded. I'd taught myself to relax, to be present, to be just a driver. But that kind of training never actually leaves, it only sleeps. And the instant a real threat appeared in my mirrors, years of deliberate calm fell away in about 2 seconds, and the old awareness came online so fast and so completely it was almost frightening, like a language you thought you'd forgotten suddenly pouring out of you, fluent, exactly when you need it. I saw the whole geometry of it at once, the two vehicles and how they were positioned, the way the trailing one hung back and the lead one slowed, the quiet stretch of road with too few witnesses, the timing. I'd seen this exact shape before, in other countries, in other lives, the professional setup. There was no part of me that hoped I was wrong, the way an ordinary person hopes. I knew. And the knowing came with a cold dread that had nothing to do with my own safety, and everything to do with the grieving woman in my back seat who had no idea she was 30 seconds from the end of her life. Sabrina was in the back seat, lost in her grief and her phone, with no idea. And I had a choice to make in about 3 seconds, and the years made it for me. They maneuvered to box us in, one ahead, one behind, the textbook beginning of exactly the kind of nightmare I'd spent a career preventing. And when those vehicles committed, when I saw the doors start to open and the men start to move, the quiet driver Sabrina thought she'd hired simply ceased to exist, and the man I used to be took the wheel of both the car and myself. That's when I said it. I turned my head just enough, and I made my voice as flat and calm and absolutely certain as I have ever made it, the voice that leaves no room for questions. And I said, "Don't move, follow me." And then I did what I was trained to do. I'm not going to give you a play-by-play because I'm not interested in writing a manual, and because the how isn't the point. What I'll tell you is that everything I had buried was still there, every hour of it, perfectly intact, the way it always is. My hands knew what to do before my mind finished the thought. My breathing slowed instead of speeding up. The fear that freezes most people turned, in me, into that old cold clarity, time stretching out, the whole situation breaking down into simple problems with simple solutions. I got us out of the trap they'd built. I used the car the way I'd been trained to use a car when it's the only thing between your principal and the people trying to take her, and I kept us out of their hands, and I got Sabrina Holt clear. And the second we were clear, I did the only thing that actually matters, the thing the movies always skip. I did not go after anyone. I did not escalate. I drove us straight and fast to the nearest police, to safety, to the people whose job this was now. Get the principal clear, get to the authorities, hand it off. That's the whole job. I got her to a police station alive and untouched, and then I sat there and let my hands shake, because they're allowed to shake after, never during. I'll tell you what it was like inside, since I won't tell you the how. It was quiet. That's the part people never believe. In the middle of the most dangerous few minutes imaginable, my mind was the calmest it had been in years. Everything that is normally noise, the worry, the bills, the low constant hum of ordinary life, all of it just dropped away, and there was nothing left but the road, the threat, the geometry, the next correct move, and the one after that. People imagine courage in a moment like that feels like a great surge of bravery. It doesn't. It feels like silence. It feels like the whole world narrowing to the few things that matter and going very, very still. My hands made decisions a fraction of a second before I was aware of making them. Decisions built on years I'd tried to forget, and every one of them was right, because that knowledge had never degraded, it had only waited. And underneath the silence, in some deeper room, there was exactly one thought holding steady as a heartbeat. Get this woman to safety and get yourself home to that little girl. Nell needs her dad to walk back through the door tonight. That thought was the engine under all of it. I wasn't just protecting a principal. I was protecting a 6-year-old's whole world, miles away, who would never know any of it had happened. Sabrina, in the back seat, had gone completely silent somewhere in the middle of it. And when we finally stopped, when it was over and the police were coming and she understood she was safe, she stared at the back of my head like she'd never seen me before in her life. Because she hadn't. She'd hired a quiet nobody to drive her car, and a completely different man had just driven her out of a professional ambush like he'd done it 100 times before, which, God help me, he had. And when she finally found her voice, the first thing she said to me, shaking, was, "Who are you?" And that question, "Who are you?" was the one I'd spent years avoiding. But sitting there in that parking lot with the adrenaline draining out of both of us, I told her the truth. The parts of it I could. About the military, about the protective work, about the life I'd had before I became a quiet single dad in a black suit. I watched it rearrange everything she thought she knew about the man who'd been opening her door for a month. The driver she'd never really looked at had a whole life she'd never wondered about, and it had just saved her from being murdered. I watched her try and fail to reconcile the two men, the quiet nobody she'd hired to drive her car, and whoever had just done what I'd done. She kept looking at me like the picture wouldn't resolve, like she was seeing double. And I understood her confusion, because I'd worked hard to make sure the picture would never resolve, to be so thoroughly unremarkable that no one would ever guess what was underneath. For a month, she'd looked right through me, and now she couldn't stop staring, trying to find the protector in the face of the chauffeur. They were the same face. She'd just never had a reason to look closely before. Almost no one ever did. That's the thing about being underestimated. It's the most effective armor there is, right up until the moment you need to take it off, and then it becomes the most devastating surprise. Gerald Holt had underestimated me, too. He'd looked at the driver and seen furniture, the same as everyone did. It was the last mistake his scheme could afford. But the part that broke her, the part that broke both of us, came after, when the police began to investigate, and the truth of who was behind it started to come out. Because it didn't take them long. These things leave threads, and when you pull them, they lead somewhere. And the somewhere they led, in this case, was the last place on earth Sabrina Holt wanted to look. The men who'd come for her had been hired, and the trail of that hiring, carefully hidden but not carefully enough, led back, in the end, to her uncle, to Gerald Holt, her father's brother, the man who'd sat with her at the funeral, the last family she thought she had. I was there when she understood it. I will never forget her face. Because losing your life to a stranger's violence is one kind of horror, but learning that the person who tried to take your life was your own blood, your dead father's brother, a man you'd trusted and grieved alongside and leaned on, that is a different kind of horror entirely, one that doesn't just threaten your body but poisons your whole understanding of your family, your childhood, every memory you have. Sabrina didn't scream or cry, not at first. She just went very still and very pale, and she said in a small voice, "He came to my father's funeral. He held my hand at the grave." And there was nothing I could say to that, because there's nothing anyone can say to that. Her own uncle had stood at his brother's grave comforting the niece he was already planning to kill. I have protected people from a lot of dangers in my life, but there is no protecting anyone from that particular wound. And watching it land on Sabrina was one of the hardest things I've ever stood witness to. Because the violence on that street, terrifying as it was, came from outside her. This came from inside. This reached back into every memory she had and rotted it. Every family dinner, every kind word at the funeral, every moment she'd leaned on Gerald in her grief and felt a little less alone. All of it was poisoned now, revealed as performance, as the patient circling of a man, waiting to strike. She had to go back through her whole life and ask which of it had been real. That's what betrayal by blood does, that a stranger's violence can't. It doesn't just hurt you. It makes you doubt your own history, your own judgment, your own ability to know who loves you. Sabrina sat there after she understood it, dry-eyed, hollow, and she said something I'll carry forever. She said, "I grieved my father with the man who wanted me dead. I cried on his shoulder." And then she said quieter, "How do you ever trust anyone again after that?" And I didn't have a clean answer for her because there isn't one. But I had a partial one, and it was sitting right there in that room, and it was me. The answer to how do you trust again is carefully and slowly, and by noticing the people who actually show up. There was at least one of those in her life now. It just hadn't been the one she expected. Gerald Holt was arrested. The men he'd hired were caught, and they talked, the way hired men do when the alternative is taking the fall alone, and the whole monstrous scheme came apart. He was held fully accountable by the law, the way it should be, not by me, not by anyone's private vengeance, but by the cold machinery of justice doing exactly what it's supposed to do. I want to be clear about that, because I'd spent a lifetime around violence, and I had no interest in adding more to this story. The law had him. That was right. That was enough. His greed had reached for everything, and it had cost him everything, which is how those stories usually end when they're allowed to end properly. Now I want to slow down, because the part that comes after the arrest is the part this story is actually about, and it isn't the ambush, and it isn't even the betrayal. It's about what happens to a person when the people who were supposed to love them turn on them, and a stranger turns out to be the one who shows up. Sabrina Holt was devastated in a way that went far deeper than the fear of having nearly died. Her family had betrayed her at the most fundamental level a person can be betrayed. The man she'd thought was her last living connection to her father had tried to murder her for money. Everything she'd believed about her own blood was a lie. And in the wreckage of that, in the loneliest moment of her entire life, the person who turned out to be standing beside her, solid, loyal, asking nothing, was not family at all. It was me, the driver, the nobody she'd barely spoken to, the hired man who'd had every reason to be just an employee collecting a check, and who had instead put himself between her and professional killers without a second's hesitation. And that did something to her, something I think mattered more than the rescue itself. Because Sabrina had just learned, in the cruelest way possible, that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, that the people who are supposed to protect you will sometimes be the very ones who harm you. And right alongside that devastating lesson, she learned its mirror image, the thing that saved her from drowning in cynicism. That loyalty and protection can come from the most unexpected place, from a stranger with no obligation to you at all, from the quiet man you never bothered to see. Her uncle, her own flesh and blood, had tried to destroy her. A nobody driver had saved her. The two truths sat side by side, and the second one, I think, is the only thing that kept the first one from breaking her completely. She said something to me later that I've never forgotten. She said, "My own family tried to have me killed, and the person who saved me was someone I treated like he was invisible. I had everything backwards. I had everyone backwards." And she was right. She'd spent her grief leaning on the man who was planning her murder while looking straight through the man who'd have died to protect her. That's the cruel comedy of it. We are so often blind to where our real safety lies. We trust the blood and ignore the stranger, and sometimes the blood is the danger, and the stranger is the salvation. I want to be careful here because I'm not telling you that family can't be trusted. That would be its own kind of poison, and it isn't true. Most families are full of real love, and most blood is loyal, and I'd never want anyone to walk away from this thinking they should suspect the people who love them. That's not the lesson. The lesson is gentler and stranger than that. It's simply that loyalty is a thing people choose, over and over, by their actions, not a thing they're issued at birth along with the last name. Gerald shared Sabrina's blood and chose, daily, to betray her. I shared nothing with her, and chose, in a handful of seconds, to protect her. Neither of those was determined by biology. They were determined by character, by the 1,000 small choices each of us had made long before that day about what kind of person we were going to be when it counted. And that means the people worth trusting are knowable if you watch for them, not by their relation to you, but by whether they show up consistently when showing up costs them something. The uncle at every dinner who was building a case for resentment. The quiet driver who said good morning and meant it. The signs were always there. We just look at the labels. Family, stranger, important, nobody, instead of at the behavior. Sabrina learned to look at the behavior. It cost her nearly everything to learn it. I'd give a great deal for her to have learned it some other way. Now, I'll be honest with you about how it went afterward, because I think the honesty matters more than a tidy ending. Sabrina wanted to do something for me, and I'll tell you what she did, but first I want to tell you what I told her. Because she started, at one point, to talk about rewards, about money, about how she could never repay me. And I stopped her. I told her I hadn't done it for that. I told her the truth, that I'd have done exactly the same thing for anyone in that car, that protecting people was simply what I was, underneath the quiet driver, and that you don't get to call yourself a decent man and then put a price on someone's life after you've saved it. I didn't want her money. I wanted her to be safe, and she was. And that was the reward. But she did do something, and she did it with a wisdom I respected. She didn't make me a charity case. She didn't just throw money at me to ease her own sense of debt. What she did was see me, finally, really see what I was. A man of rare skill and deep loyalty who'd been quietly driving a car because he'd chosen peace for his daughter's sake. And she offered me a way to use what I was, with dignity, on my own terms. A real role, a real position, one that valued exactly the capabilities that had saved her life, that let me protect people again in a way that still let me be home for Nell every night. She didn't lift me up out of pity. She lifted me up because she'd finally seen my worth, and because, after what she'd been through, she understood better than anyone alive what it's worth to have one truly loyal person in your corner. I took it, not as a handout, but as what it was, one person recognizing another, at last. And in the strangest turn of all, Sabrina Holt and I became something like real friends. Not employer and employee, not rescued and rescuer, but two people who'd been through fire together and come out trusting each other in a world that had given them both reasons not to trust anyone. She'd lost her faith in her own family. I helped her find that faith could be placed somewhere new, in people who earn it. It took her a long time to come back to herself, and I won't pretend the betrayal didn't leave a permanent mark, because it did. That kind of wound scars over but never fully disappears. For a while, she trusted no one, flinched at every kindness, hunted for the hidden knife behind every offered hand, and who could blame her? But slowly, with time, she rebuilt. She took the company her father had left her and ran it, really ran it, and ran it well, partly, I think, out of sheer defiance. The surest way to defeat a man who tried to take everything from you is to thrive with it. She learned to let a few carefully chosen people back in, the ones who'd proven themselves, and to keep at a healthy distance the ones who hadn't. She became, in a strange way, stronger than she'd been before, the way a bone sometimes heals strongest at the break. Grief and betrayal had nearly destroyed her, and instead, in the end, they forged her into someone harder to fool and harder to break. I was proud of her for that, the way you're proud of someone you watched climb out of a pit with their bare hands. And she, without quite meaning to, helped me make peace with the man I used to be, because for years I'd thought of my old life as something dark, something to be buried and ashamed of. And she helped me see that the very skills I'd been hiding had been the thing that saved an innocent woman's life. The past I'd been running from turned out to be the thing that protected the present I loved. That reframed something in me I'd been carrying for a long time. I need to say more about that, because it might be the most important thing that came out of the whole nightmare, at least for me. For years, I had split myself in two. There was the dangerous man I used to be, whom I was a little ashamed of and kept buried, and there was the gentle dad I'd become, whom I was proud of. I'd treated them as enemies, as if becoming a good father required killing off the protector I'd been, as if the two couldn't live in the same body. And that day on the road showed me, with total clarity, that they were never enemies at all. They were the same man, and that man had just used every hard hour of his dark past to keep an innocent woman alive and was going to drive home afterward and make his daughter dinner. The capability and the gentleness weren't in conflict. The whole reason a good man trains himself to be dangerous is so he can protect the gentle things. My past wasn't a shameful secret to hide from my daughter. It was the reason I could keep her and others safe. The day I integrated those two halves of myself was the day I finally stopped being at war with my own history. Sabrina gave me that, without ever knowing she did. By needing the protector, she let me forgive him. And the role she offered me afterward, the one that let me use those skills again with dignity while still being home every night for Nell, wasn't charity. It was recognition. She saw what I actually was, all of it, the dark and the gentle both. And she valued the whole man. After years of hiding half of myself, you cannot imagine what it meant to be seen complete and valued for it. But here's the honest part, the thing I always try to land on. I got lucky, in a way, that my old skills happened to be in that car on that day. Most people who are betrayed by their families don't have a trained protector behind the wheel. Most of the time that kind of betrayal just lands, with nothing to soften it. So, I don't want anyone to take from this that there's always a guardian in the driver's seat. There isn't. What I want you to take from it is something else. Something about loyalty. Because the real lesson of this whole nightmare isn't about ambushes or inheritances or trained drivers. It's that loyalty is not guaranteed by blood, and it cannot be bought with money, and you cannot always predict where it will come from. Gerald Holt had blood and chose betrayal. I had no obligation at all and chose to put my body between Sabrina and harm. The bond that actually protects you in this life is not the one you're born into or the one you pay for. It's the one that shows up when it counts, asking nothing. Treasure the people who show up, and try with everything you have to be one of the ones who does. There's one more thing, and then I'll let you go. That night, after the longest and worst day I'd had in years, I went home to Nell, and she ran to the door the way she always does, and threw her arms around my legs, and I picked her up and held her longer and tighter than usual, and she had no idea how close her dad had come, no idea what her dad had once been, no idea that the quiet man who makes her breakfast had spent that afternoon being someone else entirely to keep an innocent woman alive. To Nell, I'm just Dad, the man who comes home. And Nell, 6 years old, chattering about her day with her arms around my neck, had no idea she was the reason I'd come home at all, that somewhere in the worst minutes of that afternoon, when the old training took over and my hands moved on their own, the one steady thought underneath everything had been her face. Holding her in that doorway, I understood something that the whole terrible day had been driving toward. I'd spent years ashamed of my past, hiding it, treating the protector I used to be as a dark secret. But that protector was the reason a grieving woman got to keep her life. And he was the same man who tucked Nell in every night. They were never two different people. The man who keeps my daughter safe and the man who kept Sabrina safe are the same man, and I don't have to be ashamed of either one. I just have to keep choosing every day to use whatever I am in the service of the people who need it. That's all any of us can do. I'd love to hear from you in the comments about a time someone you trusted let you down, or a time a stranger showed up for you when your own people didn't. Those are the stories that stay with me, and I read every single one. And if you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this dark road, then you already know it was never really about the ambush, and I'm grateful you wrote it out with me. If you want to be there for the next one, you know where the button is. As for me, I've got a 6-year-old who wants pancakes shaped like dinosaurs for dinner, which is a whole negotiation, and a quiet, ordinary life I fought hard to build and would lay down my life to protect. And somewhere across the city tonight there's a woman running her father's company, safe, alive, harder to fool than she used to be, who knows it too, who learned, the hard way, that the most important person in the room is almost never the one who looks it. The world can keep thinking I'm nobody. I know exactly who I am now, and so does one little girl, and that's the only audience that was ever going to matter.